Welcome. Yes. Welcome, everyone. May I please ask you to take your seats as we are about to start this side event. Warmly welcome to all of you. The topic for today's seminar is a just transition, the path to a healthy planet and the prosperity of all. Of course, welcome to all of you here in the room, but also to everyone following us online all across the world. My name is Anna Sundström, and I am the Secretary General of the Olof Palme International Center, the Swedish labor movement's platform for international cooperation and solidarity. With our 27 member organizations here in Sweden and about 200 partners around the world, we are pushing for a sustainable, progressive development for peace, democracy, human rights, and social justice. Today's event is organized by the Olof Palme International Center in cooperation with the International Trade Union Confederation, its Just Transition Center in Oslo, the Swedish Trade Union Confederation, LO, FEPS, the Foundation for European Progressive Studies, and Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung. In today's event, we will look closer at the concept of just transition, what it entails, and how we can make it happen. We also have a new study out about this, a just transition for the global south. And you will find cards all around the room with a QR code that links to the study. And I think there might also be a few physical copies for those of you who are interested. This study looks at what is needed to achieve a just transition for countries in the global south. It collects insights from people actively working for a fair green shift, focusing on the Philippines and South Africa. What works? What are the challenges? How can this movement be strengthened, and how can international cooperation contribute to that? The event lasts 1 hour and 15 minutes, and we are doing this in person, but as I also mentioned, it's also live streamed. So once again, warmly welcome, and with this I will leave the floor to our moderator, Oskar Ernerud, head of the International Department. No, sorry, I will leave to Mikael Leiji first. I'm jumping ahead of the program. Mikael Leiji, please, the Secretary General of SOLIDAR. Welcome. Where is he? Oh my God.
Yes, sorry.
I'm confused.
Mikael comes later, but...
Sorry.
Okay, now that is a little bit unexpected, but so I'm not Mikael Leiji, nor am I Oskar. I'm Andreas Nimmelmeyer. I'm a policy analyst for climate and environment at the Foundation for European Progressive Studies, the think tank of the progressive family at the European level. We have also 68 member organizations to which both SOLIDAR and Olof Palme Center belong. And I'm also very happy to be here and would just like to set the scene here by arguing or giving a couple of high-level remarks before the panel then goes really into the nitty-gritty and the analysis and the discussion of why we should here at this environmental conference actually care about a just transition. And I think from the very beginning, it's kind of obvious to most people here in the room, but the last couple of decades, we've come also in the kind of higher level political settings to the realization that environmental politics cannot be done without a just transition, or it's not this kind of confined field that is only open to environmental ministries, high-level conferences, big international treaties, but it's actually much broader of an issue, and therefore it needs the involvement of much broader of a group of people, and most notably, because at the end of the day, environmental action and how we transform our societies, the way we consume, produce, that relates to also the way we work on our everyday arrangements. It it's about questions of values, it's about questions of rights, it's about questions of political power and who decides, who is in the room, who makes those arrangements. Are they pushed top down, or is there more of a social dialogue where people actually can co-author the solutions themselves rather than being only subject to what a national ministry or a multinational corporation thinks should be done? And I think a just transition is this framework that allows us to talk about these issues, and it's something that can be owned precisely not by big international negotiations, by multinational national corporations, but by trade unions, by people in the community. And therefore, we're going to hear a lot of people who actually have done this hard thinking and this hard organizing and have been doing the deliberations, because there are conflicts of power, because there are different interests in the room, and because it is sometimes hard to think about environmental priorities when you need to make ends meet. So the infamous thinking about the end of the month rather than the end of the world. But those things need to be brought together, and fortunately we are here in a setting where we can actually discuss it. And I think also, thanks to much of the work of the people that we're gonna hear later and their allies from in the global north, in the global south, between the different corporations, actually now this has become a mainstream thing. But we should also be cautious, because a lot of environmental concepts have been co-opted and have become devoid of meaning. So I'm very glad that you're all here to really give your expertise in the upcoming discussions to actually tell us what a just transition means from the very practice rather than from high-level political discourse. This being said, I mean, finally, if I can make one final remark, also related to the report you wrote here, the very nice report from Olof Palme Center. One thing we shouldn't forget, I think, that the just transition is also about power, which means it's not bringing all stakeholders in the room and then there's a win-win. At the end of the day, some things need to end, and some people and some organizations benefit from the current situation, and some others are fighting against. And the burden of proof, it's not that this time it's different, that now we can, with the expertise of those that have perpetuated, say, colonial extractivism or gender discrimination or workers' exploitation, that now they have suddenly become the good guys. At the end of the day, there needs to be a shift also in agency, and I think the people that we're going to hear from in the panel are very well placed to understand those struggles and have participated in them, and can tell us what are the conflicts and how they can be resolved, and where you need to be strong, where there need to be compromises. So I'm very keen to listen to all the interventions, and there I head over to Oscar, our moderator, who will introduce the panelists.
Thank you, Andreas and Anna. And it was Andreas, not Michael, right? And good morning, or just before lunch, to all the audience here and also in the streamline. Very happy to lead this conversation. Today's discussion will be about just transition. What is just transition? Why do we need it? And what do we do to actually make it happen? That's what we will discuss today. And in the order of making this as including as possible, we will, of course, hear from our panelists that I will soon introduce. But it's also, after the discussion, we have a Q&A from the floor. So please think of questions you like to ask the panelists, so we will have a good debate. So first of all, I would like to ask Samantha Smith to join me here in the floor. Samantha Smith is the director of the International Trade Union Confederation, the ITUC, at the Just Transition Center. The center's mission is to support trade unions around the world in their work for a just transition. And you represent 200 million workers in 193 countries today, right?
I think it's 162 countries, but what's, 30 countries between fronts.
We're so happy to have you, Samantha. And then I would like to introduce Dr. Godfrey Kanyense. Godfrey is the founding director of the Labor and Economic Development Research Institute of Zimbabwe, the LEDRITS. It's a think tank linked to the Zimbabwe Congress of Trade Unions, the ZCTU. And they focus a lot on green, decent work. And not at least, we have with us Nadia April. She is the program officer working with the indigenous women at the Women's Leadership Center in Namibia. The Women's Leadership Center is a feminist civil society organization that is currently building a broad campaign against oil extraction in the country. And you are welcome to sit down, because we're going to discuss for a while, so otherwise we will fall to the floor, and that is not good. So happy to have you here. And I would like to ask to start the debate. If I start with you, Samantha, a just transition, what is that?
Well, it's what's been negotiated in the UN and the International Labour Organization. And just to unpack that, it has two key characteristics. So one is that it's always based on social dialogue, and the parties to social dialogue are workers and our representatives. So that's trade unions, sometimes organizations of informal workers, employers, and sometimes government. So that's social dialogue. And then it also always has to have stakeholder engagement, so robust and continuing. And it's this process where we negotiate, at least on the trade union side, we negotiate a transition from where we are now to a world where everyone has decent work and social protection, poverty is eradicated, and all work is environmentally sustainable.
Thank you. Yeah, and we'll dig into that soon, more what we do. Godfrey, how do you explain just transition from your perspective?
Well, the starting point, obviously, from an African perspective is to acknowledge that the reality is that where we are is unsustainable. 60% of our economy is still very much agriculture, and we feel the impact of climate change. We feel the impact of these extreme weather patterns, whether it's a drought, whether it's flooding, as we saw recently in South Africa. And it does have immediate devastating impacts on employment, on livelihoods, on, the whole economy. So because it's so immediate, we feel the pinch, and hence the need, has been highlighted for us to now begin to look at alternative, sustainable ways of dealing with the environment, dealing with the issues that have led us to where we are now, so that we can create sustainable pathways to a better future. But however, as has been highlighted by Samantha, it needs dialogue, because change is always frightening. Change is something that you are not very clear about. So you need really dialogue to begin to talk, discuss, whether formally or informally. You begin to give confidence to those that fear that they may lose from this transition, so that they can begin to see how the opportunities can be shared in an equitable and fair manner, and how the challenges can be anticipated as well, so that you can manage them better. So I think this is where dialogue, as Samantha has underlined, becomes so critical to ensure that no one is left behind, not just as a slogan, but in reality. We have to ensure that the inclusivity dimension is actually put at the center of what we do.
Thank you, Godfrey. So dialogue we have heard now. And what do you say, Nadia, from your perspective? How do you describe just transition where you are?
I explain just transition as a process, and a process is a radical, economical, social, cultural, spiritual transformation from a system that is very exploitationary, it's very profit, it's very greed towards the world economy and society and the values, what really matters, the health of the planet and the people. This process must engage the empowerment of indigenous communities. It should engage rural farming communities, the urban poor communities, the unemployed youth, because we know in the global south there's a really high rate of unemployment towards the youth, and other excluded, marginalized communities and groups, and making sure that in all of these groups and in all of this process that women are in all of these groups are acknowledged as leaders, and then their voice voices are included, and there is a just transformative radical social transformation that takes place, because we cannot have a just transformation or green transformation without acknowledgement of these patriarchal systems and structures that exist in society.
Thank you, Nadia. Yes, indeed. So now we are here at the Stockholm Plus 50 conference, and with the aim to speed up our transition to a fossil-free fuel society. So we have a lot of people here and a lot of people listening to this. Why should people be concerned that the transition is not only happening, but it's also just? If we start with you, Samantha.
Well, so what we do in the Just Transition Center, we're a resource center within the global trade union movement for unions all over the world. And we work mostly with unions from high-emitting countries and high-emitting sectors. And of course, a lot of that is the energy sector. And we should be really concerned about this process and that it's done in a good way, because, just to say it bluntly, jobs in energy in most countries tend to be good jobs and often far better quality jobs, more secure, formalized contracts, better pay and benefits than jobs in other sectors. And so when we're working with workers from the energy sector and trying to, help them get a just transition for themselves and for other workers who are in the supply chain, we have to be able to show that the transition is going to be just, and that usually means you have to be able to show that there is a job of equivalent quality waiting for each worker after this transition. And if you can do that, then people will maybe not embrace the change, because probably no one in this room likes to lose a job or have your job be restructured, but they will at least not oppose it with everything they have. And that's true both for the North and the South. Is what I said about the energy sector jobs. So that's the really practical part. Like, if we want the trade union movement to be sort of supporting change, then the new jobs have to be good jobs. And the other part is about the justice of it, right? So what we see globally, and just to pick up on what Nadia said, is that every sort of big change in the means of production is accompanied, at least in the last decades, by a restructuring and a worsening of jobs, by privatization and contractualization and further extraction of labor and resources. Jobs become less safe, people get paid less, and still many people, women, depending on the country, racialized communities, indigenous peoples, are locked out of decent work. And so if you don't address those issues, that you're starting at a point where very many people don't have decent work. Most people in this world are employed informally. That means they don't have contracts, they aren't covered by employment laws, they're working casually. Then you're not going to come out with a just economy where poverty is eradicated on the other side, right? Rather the reverse, work will be worse. So as trade unions, we think everyone should have decent work. And that is also the goal of Just Transition.
Yeah, thank you. If I ask the same question to you, Godfrey, why should everyone here be concerned with making this green transition a just transition?
I've already highlighted that where we are is not sustainable. It's not a sustainable position. From an African perspective, it's already very clear. I should have also highlighted that 89% of all jobs in Africa are actually informal. They lack decent work, they are not decent jobs. So essentially, that is a discussion that we've had, and we've been able to come up with quite useful tools that the ILO, amongst others, have helped us to develop. For example, the Declaration on Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work, which Samantha highlighted. It becomes very critical experience that we've already had, where we've already been struggling to improve the quality of the jobs on the continent, the coverage, because when you talk of informal jobs, these are jobs that are not well covered or in practice, they are not actually experiencing the formal arrangements that are pertain to the formal segments of the economy. So essentially, therefore, we are saying that it's very critical to ensure that the transition basically ensures that the jobs that we are creating are jobs that respect fundamental freedoms of association. I can organize, I can be organized, I can belong to a union or an association. I can be covered through collective bargaining arrangements. There's no discrimination. There's no forced labor or compulsory labor. There's no child labor at all. There's no discrimination. There's no violence and harassment at work. All these are non-negotiable issues, whether you are talking about green or even the odd jobs. These are issues cross-cutting, indispensable values that I think we have become associated with, that we adore as a labor movement, that should inform the kinds of good jobs that we want. So in this regard, we have to use these values now in our discussions and negotiation in transitioning towards more environmentally friendly, low carbon sort of activities, carbon neutral activities, etc., that can also help us preserve this Mother Earth, not just for the current generations, but also we must think about our children and our children's children, so that future generations of workers can actually have the platform to also enjoy jobs that are not only covered through representation, but where there's dialogue, collective bargaining agreements apply, there's social protection. Because in much of Africa, most of these jobs are not even protected. There's hardly anything to cover you when you retire, eventually retire, like we all do when we come to that retirement stage. So we need actually to ensure that all these values are integrated into this dialogue and discussion towards a fair transition, and a transition that ensures basically that people can meet their basic requirements for livelihood. They can cover their basic needs through basically productive and remunerative employment. So I think this becomes also a very critical aspect, which can be associated also with the transition, because I have indicated in Africa, much of our jobs are informal. So the transition from informality to formality, reorganizing those jobs that are informal, that has got huge decent work deficits, so that can be properly covered by formal arrangements.
Yeah, thank you. So I hear decent work, social dialogue to fight informality, and job protection, fundamental rights at work. If we go to you, Nadia, the work with indigenous women and women's rights, in your line of work, why is it important that the green transition is just a just transition as well for these groups?
Because it will take all of us working together around the globe to bring about this radical social, economical, cultural, and ideological transformation that will really close the gap between rich and the poor, and not leave anyone behind. We need to work together towards this paradigm shift away from the profit-based and exploitation of the earth and the people, to really ensure that the development of green technologies benefit all the people and do not create a new form and class of billionaires. We all know capitalism is the issue. Indigenous communities and rural farming communities, the urban poor, unemployed youth, and other excluded, marginalized groups are already bearing the brunt of climate change, and in particularly women who are at arid countries such as Namibia are scraping the barren earth or picking through rubbish and dumps for food to feed their families. So in order to really create a world where the economy and society that values what really matters, the health of our planet and the people, we need to interrogate our various struggles for dignity and rights based on the values of equality, equity, sisterhood, and justice. We need to recognize the patriarchal social economic class structures that exist, that have been created, and continue to recreate all of these different forms of discrimination, exclusion, and inequalities in society based on gender, class, ethnicity, geographical location, age and ability and to dismantle them. The whole thing, we need to dismantle the systems if we're really looking for a just world. And that, I think, is very important, that everybody in this room should be really concerned about this just transition. And this is a very huge undertaking. And I think what we really need to call for is a feminist revolution and transformation.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Before we open the floor for question and answer, this Stockholm Plus 50 that we are on now aims of action that the Congress should, or this meeting should have a different action that comes up from the discussions here. And if I ask you, what kind of action would you prioritize if you can choose one to actually make this just transition happen for real, to speed it up? Samantha.
Yeah, no, it would be social dialogue for me, and also stakeholder engagement. And just why I say that, because you can't have a just transition is a negotiated process, at least for the world of work, between the collective organizations of workers, so unions, and in some places informal workers' associations, employers or capital owners, and the government most often. And you can't have that process if people don't have the fundamental rights that Godfrey talked about, right? So if you can't organize as a worker, then where is your power to organize a better future for yourself, or a good new job, or social protection? And so recognizing, fighting for these fundamental rights to organize, freedom of association, effective collective bargaining, being able to have this negotiation that is social dialogue is absolutely critical. And social dialogue can, and in some countries is, a platform where we as trade unions can also fight for our sisters and brothers in informal work. We can fight for social protection, which is for everyone, not just for trade unions, but it's, benefits that keep you and your family afloat when you're not working for one reason or another, which is true for most people in any country at any time. And we can also fight for the rights of different groups, for example, the rights of women, where we, as Godfrey alluded to, we have successfully fought for a global convention on gender violence and harassment at work. So social dialogue is absolutely key. But I don't want to leave out the sisters and brothers from civil society, because we also need this broader process of stakeholder engagement. This is also what's been negotiated on just transition to the UN. That's a more diffuse process. There are many different people and many different groups involved, including often trade unions. You're not necessarily trying to get to a binding agreement. You can't really, because people have different kinds of rights in this process. But you are trying to get to a kind of consensus and to make sure that the voice of different groups that are affected by the transition is heard. So those two things, social dialogue and robust and continuing stakeholder engagement, not just a box-ticking exercise, not just, the government making a decision and then telling people about it, but really to have these two processes.
Thank you. And the fundamental rights and the right to organize must be respected, as I can hear then. Godfrey, what would be your one action? I think they were supposed that we could get it on screen, right? Yeah. Yeah.
Well, like I have said, what is critical is to begin with the values. I think we've experienced what the system that we've had does to vulnerable to the majority of the working people. That it keeps them in the margin, it keeps them in poverty as working poor, it reduces their humanity, their dignity, and so forth. So my central issue, one, will be mainstreaming the fundamental rights and principles at work, so that we avoid the race to the bottom, like what we've experienced through globalization, where there are no values. So for me, it's symbolic that we're having this discussion in a Scandinavian country, where social values were actually at the center of the economic model. So we need to go back to an economic system that is built on inalienable rights. For example, everyone has the right to employment. Not just employment, decent employment. But it doesn't look like that anymore. It looks the majority of the people, especially in the global south, are actually making a living in the margins of the labor market. So we need to put everybody at the center through the social values, inalienable, indivisible values. That's why for me, going back to the fundamental principles in rights at work, which are not negotiable. Everyone has got a right to a decent employment, and we must start from there.
Thank you. Yeah, we come back to decent work and maybe a globalization that also benefits those who makes it a reality, because today it's a bit unbalanced, right? Nadia, what would be your action that's sent to the Congress or the meeting here at Stockholm Plus 50? Do we have it on screen? Yeah.
I think my action would be that we are calling on governments really to urgently create system for genuine, inclusive stakeholders engagement for just transition, and with special attention to equal and valued participation and decision-making of marginalized groups of people, including indigenous communities, rural farmer communities, the urban youth, and women. Acknowledge them as leaders, because I know the delegates from my country, government delegates, even speaking here at the Stockholm Plus 50, and when it comes to signing on agreements such as the Paris Agreement, everything, the government is very fast to agree to it, but when it comes to the part of implementation, it's very hard, and this is there is no implementation of really working on these agreements. And this is very evident to what's really happening in Namibia. We have a Canadian-based company, gas company that's doing exploitation in the Okavango region. This is at the east-northern part of Namibia. And this is a very sensitive area that is essential for a lot of livelihoods of people. This is looking at the indigenous people, looking at the people for farming, for water. There's a lot of survival and people depending on this. So the Namibian government really still giving licenses to this company is so questionable. While they're saying they're moving to green energy, they're in support of this, it's very questionable. This company is exploring, it's also exploring and want to go into the into Botswana, one of the UNESCO World Heritage Site that is a very spiritual importance to the indigenous people. So it was very important for the Women's Leadership Center to build, and we are currently building a civil society campaign to stop Recon Africa from doing oil and gas drilling in the region. And we had to do a lot of research in order really to understand, because we are coming from a feminist and human rights perspective, so we're not really into environmental activism. And this was the project that brought us into environmental activism. And we looked at the Niger Delta, we looked at the drilling and the fracking sites in the US to understand what is the social economical impact, what is the health impact, what is this impact on the people of the community, on the bodies of the women and girls. So this was the research we had to do, and we really looked at the indigenous people that we are working, that the Women's Leadership Center is working with. What will the social impact of this be? And the woman. So we know if there's a drilling, that means that there's an influx of people or men that will come into the area to set up man camps. We know the sexual violence and sexual and gender-based violence that happened because of this, and then the gender and power dynamics of this. Who gets the employment? Who will get this employment? Who has the skills? Will it be the local people? So we do know there's a highly skilled required jobs. So the type of jobs the local people will get, how many women will be employed in this? So this will still recreate this gap that we're trying to close for this just transformation that we are calling for. So what we did is that because we work with indigenous women, we brought the indigenous women in together so that we can really re-educate ourselves into what this means, and then to organize and share information as well, and to use the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People as a point of entry into starting the conversation, where we are calling for free, prior, informed consent. Like, we cannot have anything without the people and giving them free, prior, informed consent. So for the past 2 years, Recon Africa has been operating on the basis of a very flawed environmental impact assessment and has acquired land and used water for drilling illegally, and has not followed past best practice in regards to the protection of the environment, while leading local people to believe what it would benefit them through employment. So this concept of developing Africa, bringing investment, employment, that's the concept that always gets used. So besides the written a petition and protest by civil societies and in amendment to grant it, we are pretty sure they will get the license to continue drilling because of the ever-existing corruption in the country, because they're very closely linked. And this is very evident because in organizing protests and organizing engagement, we had a very shocking response from our head of states that when Recon Africa visited in July, that told journalists not to ask any questions to Recon Africa, and actually said that the civil society organizations are making noise and we are chasing away investors. So you could really see the high level of protection that Recon Africa really has in the country. So, and then using the term that Recon Africa is from Canada, and Canada we can trust, which we already know that in Canada, the indigenous people have been fighting very hard for these big oil and gas companies in the country as well. So we had also, with the public events, we had really making sure that we had the indigenous women's voices and them speaking for themselves. With the parliamentary meeting committee, they came to different areas to have stakeholders meetings. So while we are calling for an inclusive stakeholder meetings, that because all of the stakeholders meetings were made sure that it was not accessible, first of all, accessible to the people. It was in a language, it was not even indigenous languages, so people could not even engage in these conversations. That was another thing. And then it also seemed that the members of the committee also were already for Recon Africa, so anything that anyone was saying against the company we were very undermining of what the contribution of the women were. So once again, I really want to say government should urgently create systems, and they should genuinely inclusive stakeholders engagement for a discussion and with special equal valued participation and decision making of marginalized groups. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Nadia, for this very broad action that we need to take both, and I read into that we need to take both from the government side, but it can't be a top-down process. It's very important that it comes from the people. The people are engaged in this, both when it comes in the civil society, both when it comes to the trade unions. And now I open the floor for questions, and it was a lot of questions. Now I need some help from my colleagues here to see. I think maybe we start there. And you will get the microphone very soon.
Hi, thank you. Should I get up? My name is Jana. I'm with We Are Tomorrow, a global youth movement. And my question is actually mostly to Samantha, because this transition is going to be incredibly important for our generation and future generations. But at the same time, we see declining union membership rates. And unions have been incredibly important in fighting for workers' rights in the past, of course. But how do we ensure that they will play a relevant role for our generation, and that you take the youth along with you in the labor movement?
Are you
Thank
a
you.
union member?
I am not a union member, but I am also actually voluntarily working and precariously employed on the side. So,
Okay, so just to, not to use you as an example, but just to talk sort of broadly about these issues. So many young people also, for example, in a wealthy country like Sweden, are precariously employed. Right? So many, you're employed in service, sometimes in construction, sometimes in transport. And those jobs, as part of this process that we've talked about of jobs getting worse, those jobs also in wealthy countries, sometimes you have a ton of illegality, of wage theft. So I don't want to say that all internships and voluntary positions are a form of wage theft, but on the other hand, thinking about, some people who are in internships, yes, it is wage theft because you have skills and you should be paid for them. The employer is actually exploiting you, and they're allowed to because of the system where the only way you can get the experience you need to break into paid employment is by working for free, right? So that's a structural issue. The other thing, of course, about the employment of youth, again, in all countries, is that there's this idea that, well, we can't, employ young people in decent and paid employment because they need skills and training. But in fact, many of our youth who are unemployed in a lot of countries, including in the global south, they have a ton of skills and training. They're skilled and trained, and the issue is really that they are not, that there aren't jobs, or that the jobs are terrible because the employers can do that. So how can unions be relevant for someone like you, for example? Well, first of all, I'm just going to guess that LO Sweden has a student membership, and they also probably have, at least I know that the union that I belong to, you can belong to that union if you're self-employed. So if you're precariously employed, you can also belong to the union if you are working voluntarily not employed. And the union can also help you to understand what your rights are as a person who doesn't have standard employment and is precariously employed. I mean, I would just start with the basic stuff about jobs, because that's something that concerns all of our members and every working person. And whether you're compensated or not, and whether you're fairly compensated or not, you could join a union, we could fight for you.
Thank you, Samantha. And coming from LO, then I would say you're all welcome to be members of LO. So,
right? So
I think we take 3 questions at a time. So we, I think there was one question over there, a gentleman, yes. And we collect the questions.
Hi, my name is Andreas Nimmelmeyer, Member of Parliament in Iceland. Now, in the leadership dialogues, we're hearing talk about an equitable phase-out of fossil fuels, a lot more than we did just very recently. And I'm wondering, since we're sitting, like you said, in the center of sort of the Scandinavian model of social welfare and all that, if we shouldn't put a bit more pressure on those countries leading by examples when it comes to an equitable phase-out of fossil fuels. At the same time, Norway is opening up dozens of new exploration licenses each year. The UK leading the COP negotiations last year, and at the same time opening up new oil fields. And how the labor unions, as probably the biggest transnational democratically chosen force, how the labor unions can sort of amplify that, so that the rich countries stop being hypocrites and start just doing what they say we should do.
Thank you. Let's see, we have a gentleman in the back there.
Thank you. Yes, my name is Seva Lukashenak. I come from the YWCA YMCA of Sweden, also the global youth movements of YWCA and YMCA. And you've been talking about decent jobs and right to organize and structural change and so on. But I also have a question about not only decent job or work, but also meaningful ones. And we have today's young generation who not only want to work and get proper payment, but also want to work with something that they find meaningful. And I think it's also connected to the fact that we also need not only meaningful jobs, but also meaningful leisure, which we in the civil society and youth movements are trying to create. So that's my question to you. Do you work with providing meaningful jobs and making jobs meaningful? And what do you think about it besides the quite usual, unfortunately, common remark of, young people just don't want to work, just don't want to do fun stuff, which is not true.
Thank you. Shall we have one last? I think, yeah, in white shirt. It's a running microphone here, I'm sorry.
Thank you. First, thank you for organizing this wonderful panel. And my question is, so as Nadia also mentioned, the just transition lies at the intersection of social, environmental, and economic dimensions. And I don't really see that recognized yet. I would be just curious if you do see that recognized, this interconnection between these fields. And obviously there is a huge political gap at this point in the Global South, especially because of economic growth-led social policies that countries most usually pursue. How do you think this gap could be overcome if there is any way to find a mean to tackle these policy areas together? Because I do believe it would be, and I think a lot of people would agree with that it would be more efficient even to address these policies together.
Thank you. Maybe we start with the last question on the gap. I think the gap just between men and women, but the unjust financial, economically gap we had in the global world. This is a question that how do we make the gap disappear? Would you like to say something about that, Nadia?
Yes. It just like I was saying. It's all about a very radical social transformation. That's the only way we can have this gap, really lowering the gap. And I think it's very important to understand why these gaps exist. I mean, if you come to my country, there's a huge inequality gap between the rich and the poor. And that gap goes more further when it comes between men and women, or comes between indigenous communities and all of that. And then we can also look at the historical aspects of this, how this gap has started, So people also do not own the land that they are on. So how do we, by addressing these existing issues and really finding solutions and really finding ways to solve these issues, that's the way we can close this gap. Yeah.
Yeah. I guess, Godfrey, you also have a point of view on the gap, right?
Yeah, as an economist, I get worried, really worried. When I studied economics, we had subjects like economic history, political economy, social aspects. But now when I look at my child who is also studying economics at the University of Cape Town, all the social aspects have been removed. It's now a number crunching exercise. The economic model that is being used globally, which is driven at the base of the international finance institutions, is simply opening up economies to the interests of capital. And that development should be about people and their aspirations, which brings to light the question that was raised about meaningfulness of our jobs, etc. Because if you look at the definition ILO uses, we talk about freely chosen, full employment. That's why I highlighted that it doesn't look like, these aspirations are real, is it? Because when you look at the real world we are living in now, these things are no longer at the core, at the center of what we do. And I go back to what Andreas highlighted. It's about power. It's about power relations. So we need to do proper power mapping and stakeholder analysis. Who has got the power? How are they using that power? For whose interest is this global economy working? It is not certainly working in the interest of women, as Nadia has highlighted. It's not also working in the interest of the global south, where our cabinet basically is run by international capital. When they come in, even if you look at our economic blueprints, they say, oh, how are we going to develop? Someone, international capital is going to create jobs, going to do. We are so disempowered through this economic model. It no longer says that it's about us. It's no longer built from below. It's built from above. And I have never seen a country that is built from above. It's built sustainably from below. The people and their aspirations must be at the core, at the center of what we do. So that's why I was highlighting these inalienable rights issues about social values, reconstituting this world. I mean, it won't come. It's about class struggle. It won't just come on its own. We have to organize. What we always said in the trade unions, that we need to go back to the trenches to organize, to basically create a basis for an alternative that is informed by these social values. Otherwise, we continue with this sort of world economy, which is driven by the interests of greed, actually greed. Someone can actually get like what happened during the global crisis of 2007, 2008. You destroy, a company, you destroy people's pensions, and you're given millions of dollars to thank you for destroying livelihoods. So I think this is not the world that we need. We need to go back to values. That's why I'm highlighting and emphasizing that we go back to values. A system that is based on solidarity, for example, between the North and South. Issues that we have seen solidarity forever. Is it still forever? There's no more solidarity to talk about in the construction of the global economy that the WTO and others are actually imagining and creating. So I think we need to go back to basics again, to begin to build on these fundamental rights and principles that we highlighted, and to put back humanity, people, and their aspirations at the center of what we're doing. We're involved in some project, very interesting, with young people as well. It was called Training for Rural Economic Empowerment. And we were basically talking to young people about what they want to do. Within their communities, they created sort of steering committees to discuss what they wanted to do in terms of what jobs they wanted. So the issue of making these jobs meaningful. And they'll come up with ideas. These young people are creative. But in the current discourse, we tend to, someone sitting in Washington or elsewhere tends to come up with solutions for the problems that are down in our countries. So we need to go back to empowering the communities, like she was highlighting. The women, persons with disability, young people that basically do not have a voice at all in this current construction. So we need to go back to basics.
Yeah. Thank you, Godfrey. And if we take a question from our Icelandic colleague on how rich countries, you live in Norway, Samantha, and you know what a rich country, what can the rich country do to push and go take the necessary steps? And also on the meaningful jobs. Today, the digital taylorism, like we can talk about, that some jobs are actually more one-sided than ever right now, even in this modern time we live in. How do we fight that?
Yeah, well, I don't know which question to start with, but I think I'll start with the question about meaningful jobs. So just to say, as a trade unionist, our starting point is that all work is or can be meaningful and important. Right? So a job working in a restaurant, I have 2 kids working in service, not to sort of situate myself, but I have 2 kids working in service, and I'll fight the person who tells me that their jobs are not meaningful and important. Their jobs should be good. And so jobs that I think the bigger question about making jobs meaningful and important, especially many of the jobs that young people can get because of the system that we discussed earlier that is depriving young people of decent work, is what about skills and training for all jobs? Because all jobs do require skills and training, and getting skills and training, having lifelong learning and the ability to educate yourself in your job and to improve your skills and your compensation progressively, like that's the key to jobs being good. And that applies for everyone, for example, in a hospital, not only the doctors and the intensive care nurses, but also the cleaners and the healthcare workers who are working with patients, right? So just to say that also the jobs that don't seem very meaningful in the sense that you're not necessarily working for a civil society organization, but you might be doing something super important in our society, and you find those jobs everywhere. And instead what's happening is that those jobs get sucked of meaning by exploitative employers and by the lack of opportunities for skills training and advancement. So, I just want to sort of fight for also for blue-collar workers, right? Because that's the majority of the workers we have in this world, and their jobs also can be good and meaningful. To to this question that you asked, I could see you looking at me. I'm just coming straight from the Congress of the Norwegian Trade Union Confederation. I'll say two things. So, first of all, on a practical level, as we talked about at the start of this discussion, energy sector jobs are often the best jobs in an economy, right? And that includes jobs in fossil fuels. And so if you want people to support losing those jobs, or at least having them change dramatically with this potential for restructuring and making jobs worse that we get every time there's restructuring, there has to be a new good job in front of them. So that is just transition, right? So if you feel like the trade union movement isn't doing enough, I can say that in the 5 or 6 years I've been working with Just Transition, there's a huge change in our movement. I would say that our affiliates all over the world and energy sector unions, they understand that change is here. They understand there's this thing called just transition, but there are many obstacles to them getting that for their members, which is their job as trade unionists. So one is, I feel like we are doing a lot as a whole movement, including both people who work in fossil fuels and people who don't. The other thing specifically about Norway is that, first of all, I think we're going to get a resolution out of our Congress today, which will be somewhat different on the issue of oil and gas. I don't want to say what it is because that still has to be negotiated. With the war in Ukraine, Norway has, our government and our companies have been asked by the European Commission, by different European governments, and also by the United States to increase its supply of gas to Europe. We are now the single biggest supplier of gas to Europe, with Russia progressively cutting off gas supplies to different European countries. I don't have an answer to that. Right? So I don't have an answer to how we are going to phase out oil and gas in this period right now where a lot of people might be cold in Europe this winter if Norway doesn't continue to pump gas to Europe. I do think that over time the picture looks differently. We're talking about a moment in time. We're also looking at Europe, the biggest market for Norway, which is simultaneously going to go through this massive transition away from fossil fuels and also try to replace Russian oil and gas. And so if we want to be a part of that, we're going to have to do both things at once in Norway too. That's all I got.
Thank you, Samantha. Yeah, I think we have time for one more question. I'm very sorry, but time is maybe the gentleman right in the front. I think you will have a microphone so our listener on the, web can hear us. Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much. My name is Faisal Gattan. I'm from Saudi Arabia. I'm the Deputy Minister for Labor Market Policies and Human Capital Development at the Ministry of Economy and Planning. We're going through, listening to Samantha and Godfrey and Nadia, we're going through a very significant transformation from an economic and a social perspective. The discussions around trade unions, so my first question, Samantha, is directed towards you, but we're now in the process of thinking about how do we structure these relationships and how we can provide worker rights in a efficient, fair, and just, transparent kind of way. What are some of the common pitfalls or issues or challenges that you see in a society where this kind of relationship is starting to form and emerge, and the need for it is starting to become an issue? What are some of the legislative frameworks that need to be in place in order to preserve and protect those rights? Because quite honestly, I mean, not only is the private sector resistant to these kinds of structures, but we're finding that also employees are worried about what you just mentioned about if I engage in these kinds of practices, will my job be safe, or will I struggle with these kinds of issues? And my second question, very quickly, is for Godfrey about the social values discussion. So I fully agree with you. I think that there is this discussion around moving away from these metrics that are just about GDP, unemployment, and these macro level indicators, and one should really think about human capital development and things beyond GDP. But in your experience, Godfrey, and working in some African contexts, do you think that the association or the focus on social values inherently becomes a question of religion and ideology or legacy issues around, how religion and ideology has formulated those social values, and how do you move past this idea as you're transitioning out or as you're trying to justly move towards a new state of the world? This is sort of one of the questions. Social values is a big part of cultural, and social values are a big part of the Saudi fabric. And wanting to move away from this, or wanting to sort of pivot when it comes to issues around, the participation of women in the economy and those kinds of things. How do you try to reimagine or reformulate the contours that have, historically outlined what social values are in a different kind of way? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your question, sir. Can you please answer those quite briefly?
Yeah. So super quickly, that's a big question. But the place to start would actually be the International Labor Organization, right? So, I mean, there's, their core conventions, but in addition to that, the ILO, like a whole part of their job in the UN is to convene social dialogue between the government, the employers, and workers, and our organizations, and also to sort of support governments as they're going through this process of approving the ILO core conventions and starting to have an organized workforce, or at least people with rights to freedom of association, freedom of expression, and the right to effective collective bargaining. And the other place to start would be, we have a regional trade union center for the Arab world. And if you want to give me your card, I can put you in contact with them, as well as the appropriate part of the ILO.
Thank you, Samantha. Yes. Godfrey, there were questions raised to you on role of civil society and social questions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, this is not a new debate. We've had it. And in the Global South, we are very much involved. You remember in the 80s and 90s, during Thatcherism and Reaganomics, when Reagan was president of the US, and they were pushing this neoliberal sort of brand of economics, which entailed basically creating flexible economies where capital can just come in, in the name of efficiency, effectiveness, etc., ignoring social values, and so forth. It's quite interesting that even the World Bank, for example, in 2008, came up with the Growth Commission. They brought together a team of experts, one of my favorites, Robert Solow, amongst others, where they started reflecting on that economic model. And they started saying, well, I think there's something wrong with this model because of the resistance that was coming. It was no longer sustainable. We're talking about sustainability. There were people revolting. You remember 50 years is enough. We're stomping the streets in Washington. I was involved in the mid-90s, saying 50 years is enough. You remember back then. And then that's the context in which even the IFIs themselves, international finance institutions themselves, started undertaking research, different kind of research, where they were saying, by the way, I think equality matters. Because if we leave all these groups, we are actually not tapping into the creativity and innovation that these groups may have, women. In Africa, if you empower a woman, we say, you empower a community. You empower a man, you empower an individual. So these are some of the nuances that are coming now, where even the World Bank, the IMF, are beginning to reflect and say, equity matters, inequality matters to growth. It creates a growth that is not sustainable. Even in Africa, we had an extraordinary meeting of heads of state and government in Ouagadougou. Remember, the economists wrote about Africa Rising, the Africa Rising narrative, following growth rates that had actually surpassed the traditional 3%, going to about 5% and so forth. And then people were wondering, why is it that despite these growth rates of above 5% in Africa since the millennium, the poverty levels are not falling as rapidly as elsewhere? And then they said, no, it's because that growth is not associated with decent employment. So employment is the nexus between growth and poverty reduction. I think even the World Bank, they started actually accepting this. This juncture is what we had the hypocrisy now. Whilst they admit, but then the essence of that model remains the same. So rhetoric runs ahead of actual practice.
Yeah.
Whilst they may admit that equality matters, inequality hates growth. it has development, because then it creates conflict. Those that are left out will mobilize against the World Bank. And if you read some of the articles of the IMF, they are raising these issues, the importance of human development and all those the aspects. UNDP has come up with the human development concept after Amartya Sen, which tries to bring these freedoms and rights at the center, at the core. Because let's begin to think about it. These rights are fundamental. The right to work, the right to shelter, the right to health. These are issues that should not be negotiable, because one day without health is one day too many. One day without food is one day too many. So these are issues of a matter of life and death. One day without water, we say water is life. And yet, when we privatize and commoditize water, the majority of our people cannot afford, cannot access something that is as fundamental as life and death, healthcare in our jurisdictions. So they are also beginning to say, that's why when they came up now with the poverty reduction strategy papers in the late 1990s, the World Bank, they were saying, let's ring fence social expenditures. But then the cracks of the model remained almost intact. So we were playing around with the margins without really addressing the core. So that's why we're saying that a rights-based approach is critical. Because these things are critical, life and death issues, health, food, shelter, work. All these things are fundamental.
I need to stop you there. I'm very sorry.
you.
But I invite you to have the debate after the seminar. And I will just super briefly try to do a summary of the discussion that I think has been really good and in-depth. Is that I've heard social dialogue a lot of times, that we need to engage people. It's not a top-down process. We need to work together with the civil society, with the trade union family to make this happen, and we need to push governments to also make it happen. I thank you very much, and I think the panelist is awarded an applaud.
Thanks, Nadia. Thanks, Samantha.
And by that, I would like Anna Sundström to take the floor again, please.
Thank you very much, and of course a big thank you to our wonderful speakers here today. And I just by this end of the seminar now once again want to remind everyone about the publication that we launched today, and as I mentioned in my introduction, we'll find these postcards spread around this room with this little QR code where you can also access your own copy. And the study summarizes also a bit of the discussion that we've had here today and what our comrades in the trade unions and civil society sees as necessary for a just transition. And of course, it's relevant to all of us who wish to support this shift globally. I am now less confused because now it is actually also my task to also leave the floor to Mikael Leiji, the Secretary General of SOLIDAR, one of the co-hosts of this seminar. But let me end by also reminding everyone and quoting Olof Palme in his speech at the first environmental conference in Stockholm in June 1972. I am convinced, he said, that we can find solution, but it is absolutely necessary that we cooperate internationally. We are really very much in a hurry. Solutions will require far-reaching changes in attitudes and community organization. Of course, now, 50 years later, we can see that these necessary changes have not taken place, and the time is now even more scarce. But we, of course, have a chance to make this happen. It is about action. I think action is the word of this conference, right? And we also know that a just transition also holds one of the necessary keys for this. The humanity faces its greatest challenge, and together we must solve it. For our common security, for our common future, the need for international action remains acute. And multilateral cooperation holds the key, not putting your own country first and turning away from international cooperation, but embracing local community organizing, international cooperation, and of course, a clear vision of inclusive and sustainable societies. We can do it if there's courage and political will to put our common future first. Please, Mikael Leyer, Secretary General of the SOLIDAR.
Thank you. Thank you, Anna, and I'll be brief in my final remarks, as much has already been said, but I want to start by thanking our partners to this event, Olof Palme International Center, ITUC, ITUC Just Transition Center, the Swedish Trade Union Confederation, FEPS and FES, for bringing Just Transition to the table of Stockholm Plus 50 in hopefully a new and more meaningful way. We social movements and trade unions are eager to contribute to the green transition and have a lot to say on behalf of the millions of workers, people in vulnerable situations and systematically marginalized communities that we represent. The latest IPCC report confirmed what trade unions and civil society have been saying for decades, that the transition to climate neutrality and environmental sustainability is only possible if it's inclusive and fair and just towards all, everywhere. It's the only possible way to achieve our environmental and climate goals. For us at SOLIDAR, a network of progressive civil society organizations across Europe, this means advancing social justice hand in hand, and not parallelly or separately with climate and environmental action. It means taking the social impact of climate and environmental policies into account, as well as ensuring that these do not exacerbate existing inequalities and forms of discrimination, but rather solve them. It involves strengthening social protection system, reversing the process of neoliberal privatizations, capital accumulation, taxing wealth more effectively, and leaving austerity measures behind. It centers on equality and redistribution and realizes that the transition we so urgently need must transform our lives, economies, and societies. A just transition must be the overarching aim for all policy at local, regional, and national level. But this process, as we've heard, will not go anywhere, will not become anything without meaningful and structured dialogue with trade unions, civil society organizations, and affected communities. And it's time that we are listened to. We've been saying this for years without proper attention. That's why SOLIDAR and the Olof Palme International Center, together with a lot of our friends at the European level, has created the European Alliance for a Just Transition here in Sweden. We have started the Swedish Alliance for a Just Transition, which bring together a very diverse group of stakeholders such as trade unions, social NGOs, political actors, environmental movements, and more, in order to join and coordinate our efforts, demand a seat at the table, to make sure that the transition we need is truly just. And I end my brief intervention with a plea to all of us, everywhere. We need to organize these broad alliances at all levels, and that we demand together that a table is set for us to make proper decisions for the benefit of us all. With this, I would like to thank you all for joining us this not morning. Well, if you're in Sweden, it's not morning; it's actually almost afternoon. But I wish you a continued great day. I look forward to working with all of you to make sure that we win the just transition that we need. Thank you very much on behalf of everyone who organized this event. Looking forward to see you soon.